it ended up in Flatwoods. One went over Baltimore, ended up going toward Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is actually over here in Dayton, Ohio. And then this one, this was the first one, was going toward Oak Ridge Nuclear Facility in Tennessee, which is right around here. And there was another one that came up from the south. This one from the south was engaged by this gentleman here. This is the pilot and his radar man were lost that day. Frank got into an entire multiple year attempt to find out everything he could about this and basically succeeded. He went to the grave of that. His name was John. Oh my God. Why can I not remember these names? Anyway, I have the book right here too. Frank found him, and there you have it. And so we talked quite a bit. There's Oak Ridge. He talked about how the F-86 Sabre, the F-94 Starfire, and the F-7 U-3 Cutlass were equipped with rockets. You can see them very clearly on this depiction, that were new in 1952 and were equipped, or at least capable of inflicting damage on these objects that we had not been able to do before. That's his argument. So there you have it. I can't believe I can't remember the guy's name, but sorry. There's only so many things I can keep in my head at one time, and Frank could tell you, and I just can't remember. But anyway, it's fascinating. So I'll be getting. I strongly encourage you to listen to it. It's fun to listen to Frank talk about this case. He's a very down to earth researcher, as you know. When you hear him, there's no pretense here. He's just laying it all out as best he can. And it's something I appreciate about him. And you'll be able to listen to the next two parts in the next couple of days. I'm working on that. I did talk about 1952 in my live stream yesterday. And that's an interesting case. Again, I would encourage you to go check out the live stream. I'm going to show you a couple of images here from that. This is the radar operator. This is Washington National Airport in July, I think it's July 19th, 1952. That's the first night of the engagements. Talked quite a bit about this. This was a very, very major event. Here's some of the headlines. I guess one of the things that's interesting to me about talking about these types of cases is how, after all these years, they are really not appreciated by the general public and by our established authoritative media for just how important they were. I think there's very distinctive reasons for that. And actually, I talked quite a bit about this in my live stream yesterday. This man here, this is Howard Coughlin. I mentioned him a little bit. A newspaper piece covered him for the first weekend of sightings. He saw these things, knew about them on radar, and saw them with his own eyes. He was there. He was written about. And one thing I mentioned is this is me interviewing Howard Coughlin. This is over 10 years ago, and it was not long before he died. I think he died 2 months after this interview. One thing I didn't mention is the context of this interview. I was involved in doing a pilot for a TV show that never got off the ground. And my producer, who was a friend of mine, arranged for this interview with Howard. This was in the general vicinity of Philadelphia. I think this was in New Jersey. And we visited Howard. I led the interview. Howard was very hard of hearing. He was 90 years old, but still very much in his right mind. I would have to say he was very clear thinking and had no problem remembering what he saw and giving his opinion that this object did not look like any ordinary aircraft. So it was really nice to be able to talk with him. I have a 3.5 minute clip that was given to me by the producer. Even though this never aired on TV, I might be able to work with it and make it available in one way or another. It's worth having. So that's Howard, and he was there that weekend. He was, I think, he had to be the last surviving air traffic controller or person in the tower from that weekend, and it was good to be able to talk with him. One of the things that I mentioned in my talk with Frank Vicino about 1952, and I think I mentioned this in my live stream yesterday, was this man, Wilbert Smith. Talked a lot over the years about Wilbert Smith. He's very important. He was a Canadian government official. And one of the things in relation to 1952 is a statement that he made toward the end of his life. Smith was interviewed by two men. This is in 1962, 10 years after the event. And Smith was dying of cancer at the time, unfortunately, and talked about having once had in his possession a very small piece of a flying saucer that was apparently shot by the United States Air Force. And this is something that Smith was saying. He got a piece that was loaned to him, he said. He said, it had been loaned to me for a very short time by your Air Force. He's talking to two Americans. He says, as a general thing, they differ only in that they are much harder than our materials, and talks a little bit about it. I don't know the science of this. A matrix of magnesium orthosilicate. It had great numbers, thousands of 15 micron spheres scattered through it. That's quite fascinating. And then they said, well, what happened to it? He said, well, I had to give it back. Who'd you give it back to? The Air Force? He says, nope, higher than that. CIA? He says, look, higher than that. I'm sorry, gentlemen, but I don't care to go beyond that point. I can say to you that it went into the hands of a highly classified group. You will have to solve that problem, their identity for yourselves. Fascinating. Wilbert Smith. That was like the last little bomb he dropped in his life for the UFO phenomenon, for the UFO community. Quite interesting. I think 1952 and the overflights of these UFOs for 2 weekends in a row, actually probably 3 weekends in a row over DC, is incredibly important. And I did my best in that presentation to explain why. One of the comments below I just saw after was someone said something like, damn it, Richard Dolan, that was too short. And it was 52 minutes. It was one of the longest Saturday live streams I did. I don't know what more they want. I don't want them to go on more than an hour. That's long enough. One of the other big things on my mind, I talked about this in my live stream yesterday, and I've been talking about it a lot because it really is worrying me very, very much, is the growth in censorship of our internet. This is not news to any of you. UFOs have always been marginalized by our society. You know, before we had Google and before we had YouTube and Facebook and Amazon, and we still had the mainstream press and the establishment media, which did a very good job of marginalizing and censoring out UFO information. But the thing is, if you go back to the 1940s and 50s, it wasn't as profound as it is now. In the 1950s, there were still a number of independently owned newspapers and radio stations and the like that would cover this subject. And so there were scattered shots of UFO information that was coming out to the world. And what occurred to me, that there were two prongs of an attack on this freedom of information way back then, before the internet. Prong number one was greater and greater corporate consolidation over the media. So whereas in the 1950s, you had hundreds of significant independently owned media operations. By the 1980s, I think it had gone down to like 50 corporations that were owning 90% of all media. Now that number is 6, of course. But there was greater and greater levels of consolidation that took place. Incidentally, a good old book on this is called The Media Monopoly by a journalist named Ben Bagdikian. I used to have that book. I don't have it anymore, but I read it. And that was back in the 1980s, and he was talking about media consolidation. It's only accelerated since. So that's one attack on free press. And then the other attack, or political infiltration operations like Mockingbird, which I've talked about many, many, many times, where you have CIA and other government infiltration of major media to provide propaganda and spin on behalf of the government. That's the original fake news, and it's a real thing. So we've always had that. So we're deluding ourselves if we think this is a new phenomenon. It's not a new phenomenon. But now what we're seeing in the age of YouTube, age of Google, is a new variation of that. And if you really think historically about this, you can say that the 1990s and the first decade of the 2000s of the 21st century were a significant resurgence of intellectual freedom and press freedom, or information freedom, in the world. I believe that the freedom of the internet of the 90s and of, much of the early part of this century was an unforeseen development by the hierarchy, if we can call it that. I don't believe anyone could have predicted what happened, the amount of freedom of exchange of ideas and so forth. And that's a very powerful thing. So I think we're now at a point where that hierarchy has been actively working and successfully to roll back that freedom of expression to whatever degree that they're able to do. And so they've got this war on fake news. Unbelievable. Are we really talking about Russian or Chinese technology? Does anyone believe that? Does any one person believe that the 2004 Tic Tac UFO could have been Russian or Chinese? And I think the answer is absolutely no. I don't see any cause for going down that road in that explanation. If you do, please make a comment. Please open a thread. I don't see that. Is there a cause for saying that this is something of ours? Ours meaning American. Everyone asks this. But I'm going to be honest with you and say I'm coming up empty here. I don't see how I can justify that. I talked with Kevin Day about this when we were together in just a few weeks ago. And he absolutely believes no, that he doesn't think that it's anything that we're making. Kevin's someone that is really worthy of respect. I'm going to be interviewing him soon. I'm making a point of it. It's not just his integrity, which is extremely high in my view, but it's his technical expertise at his job. When he was in the Navy, he was extremely familiar with aircraft of all types and technology. He was very sophisticated. And I just think he also came up empty when he thought of anything that could have duplicated these performance characteristics. Remember, it was Kevin Day who was operating the radar at the time who saw an object, one of these objects, go from 28,000 feet to sea level in 0.78 seconds. It's more than 20,000 miles per hour, and then just stop. No one in the military, no one in the media is asking these questions. And I think they need to be. So I think, this is really significant. And then the other validations of the other videos is also quite significant. The gimbal UFO video, which is connected in some way to the sightings of the USS Roosevelt in 2014, 2015. I'm not sure about how the details of the gimbal video fit in with the whole sum total of all of those sightings that took place in 2014, 2015. And similarly, the Go Fast video. But all of that's really significant that the Navy validated. So now, to the real point of what I want to talk about, which is what is really happening here. About a year ago, I don't know when it was, I was using the phrase controlled disclosure to describe what we're seeing. And I'm revisiting that interpretation. I'm not sure if I'm comfortable actually calling this controlled disclosure. I would call it controlled disclosure if I thought this were coming from a sanctioned high-level government or political type of authority or military authority that said, all right, we're going to roll this out. And when all of this started, I was much more inclined to think that that was a real possibility. The fact is, I don't really know if I think that's the case. To me, the UFO data that's been coming out over the last few years, all of it, as far as I can see, it seems like a very careful and controlled messaging, yes, in a bid for a disclosure of sorts. Certainly not complete. It's very careful. But it might be more accurate to call this an insider disclosure. Back over the last decade, after I wrote AD After Disclosure in particular, I did a variety of lectures for years, actually, in which I tried to evolve my ideas of how disclosure might go down. Bryce Zabel and I wrote that book back in 2010, and then we revised it in 2011. And we had a certain idea. I had a certain idea of how I thought a disclosure event could occur. That idea was basically predicated on the fact that we were in very tumultuous times. More and more people had cell phone cameras and video cameras and were able to record unusual things that were occurring. Organizations like WikiLeaks were out there now and stirring up the pot and disrupting the paradigms, disrupting our society, and that something unexpected would very possibly happen that would throw the secret into the secret keepers into disarray. That was my fundamental premise, and Bryce, I think, agreed with that fundamentally. But it occurred to me, and it's not that it didn't occur to us during the writing of the book, but I wouldn't say that we fleshed this out as well as I was fleshing it out after the fact, that there are a variety of ways that disclosure could go down. And that was definitely one way, kind of an accidental situation where something unexpected happens. But there could also be a disclosure, I concluded, by a kind of the controlled disclosure scenario of a kind of a globally developing fascist type of a state that sought totally to control the narrative of UFOs as it rolled out its very controlled version of events. So that's a kind of controlled disclosure. At first I called that a very melodramatically fascist disclosure. And I still think that that's a really definite possibility that we're looking at, a form of fascist or controlled disclosure where all of the communications of our society are very micromanaged and controlled, and bad thinking is relegated to the fringe. And when that happens fully, of a safe version of disclosure might be rolled out. But then there was something that I called for many years insider disclosure, and just predicated on the reality that over many years there have been a variety of people with a greater or lesser degree of being plugged into the loci of power who have tried to pry information out and get information out on UFOs to the public. Whether people like Donald Kehoe back in the 50s through NICAP, trying to get congressional hearings on UFOs, or writing his books and trying to get the information out there and move this thing ahead, or fast forward to people like James and McDonald, and then in our own era, the disclosure movement, people like Stephen Greer, Stephen Bassett, even, to the extent that I participated in it myself, in conjunction with genuine, well, that type of disclosure, actually, I wouldn't say is insider disclosure. That's people-driven disclosure. And then insider disclosure would be, well, there hasn't really been much. You've got, I was thinking, I mentioned Kehoe earlier because Kehoe was constantly talking to people on the inside, people like Roscoe Hillenkoetter of the CIA, his friend, who were trying to get congressional hearings going. So you get a kind of crossover between these insiders and working with the public. But, insider types have over time talked about whether or not this information can come out. And even though it's been the most low key of all the different types of disclosure possibilities that I used to look at, I think what we're seeing right now with TTSA is a type of insider disclosure. That's what I think is happening. I think that, and these people aren't the highest level insiders, but they have enough insider connections. They have enough security clearances. They've shared over a long period of time enough information amongst themselves that I think they constitute a genuine faction. And I think that this is what they're doing. They've developed their allies within various structures of power, within the media, within the political world, particularly to help them get their messaging out. And I think that there are opponents of them as well. Call it a deep state of enemies. I think that's probably right. And so when we see these admissions that we just got of the U.S. Navy, is the U.S. Navy's statement recently about these videos being real, is that part of the disclosure process? I would say no. I think what it is, it's an admission of something that's already been out there, and it's fundamentally a rear guard action. That's what I think. I don't think that the Navy itself is authorizing UFO disclosure. I mean, as crazy as it sounds, because everyone, in the last 2 years, it's been all about the U.S. Navy. But I think what's happened is there has been efforts from TTSA, and really most of this is coming from them. And they've got people within the Navy. The Navy's very big. And they're able to just wheedle and cajole certain statements out due to very, I think, intelligent pressure. And again, in the words of what one of them said to me, it's just more toothpaste out of the tube. Once the information's out, it can't go back in. And I think the United States Navy has been in the position where there have been enough individuals with connections to the Navy that have been able to enable some of this information to come out. But I think it's very premature to see this as a coordinated, concerted effort by the highest level Navy leadership. And it's taken me some time to really formulate this idea with any clarity. But I think I'm right. I think that this is what it is. I don't think we're looking at a controlled, government orchestrated disclosure.